This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern, and I'm joined here in the studio by our very own co-host, Dalia Shandlin. Hello, Dalia, and welcome back.
Thank you. Always nice to be here.
Very nice to have you, as always. Every week, Dalia and I will be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. Our guest today is a Middle East scholar and the founding president of Shalem College in Jerusalem. He is one of the leading experts in his field, as well as the author of numerous books, including most recently The War on Error, Israel, Islam and the Middle East, that was recently published by Transaction Publishers. Professor Martin Kramer, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
I'm delighted to be here. Great admirer of your program.
I'm absolutely honored to hear that.
We wanted to start by asking you a general question about the book, and, love to have you expose as much as you want and discuss the different chapters. But what I really want to understand is, you've called the book The War on Error, and there's a basic premise that when the rest of the world looks at the Middle East, and I think probably specifically you mean Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but you do look at the broader Middle East understanding in general, that people are getting it wrong. And I want you to explain this thesis. We have a society, a part of the world where we have just, a battery of researchers and academics and journalists and, in fact, probably, large press corps, foreign press corps covering this region compared to other parts of the world, and just many engaged, some would even say obsessed individuals constantly researching this region. Do you think they really all get it wrong? Or could it also be that just any part of the world that somebody's not from, they may get wrong, and maybe we get the Far East wrong, maybe we get Southeast Asia wrong too? I'd like to hear how you see the premise of this book.
I think experts in every field get things wrong all the time. It's often in a way that is no different than that of laymen. And I don't have to mention everything from the financial crisis to the unexpected election of an American president who all the experts thought wouldn't be elected. The list is very long. So I don't want to make the Middle East an exceptional case in this regard. I do think that in almost every instance, the explanation of error is the more compelling question. And whether it's the Middle East or whether it's a financial crisis or whether it's the American elections, it comes down ultimately to bias. The role played by bias in filtering and in distorting information as it comes across. Now, the Middle East does have a few particular problems. One is that obviously the flow of information here is much more restricted in most parts of the region than it is, for example, in the United States. In the United States, in the lead up to the American elections, there were plenty of polls. There was ample access to journalists. Information seemed to come freely. In fact, information that no one expected to get, such as the leaks that came out of Democratic National Committee and so forth. But in the Middle East, you have regimes which are interested in restricting the flow of information. So in that respect, a lot of error just arises from the fact that people have an incomplete database. But I don't think that's the main cause of error. The main cause of error is the role that bias plays in filtering information. And, of course, people in this region are committed to political projects. They have an interest in promoting one or another side or aspect of various conflicts. And that's what accounts for a large measure of the error.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say are the big manifestations of those errors? Specifically, you can discuss some of the ones that you want to talk about from the book.
When I talk about error, I mean something very specific. I don't simply mean differing interpretations. Where would we be without differing interpretations? Historians do it all the time. Political analysts do it all the time. It's perfectly understandable, and I don't categorize that as error. I also don't consider as error predictions of the future which go awry. Mm-hmm. There are always many more scenarios for the future than the one scenario that occurs. And one can reasonably expect that there'll be a wide range of let's say, missed predictions. I'm talking about something more specific. It is a gap, usually unintentional, between reality and its representation.
Unintentional but biased.
Unintentional but biased. That's right. Okay. The bias is usually unconscious. There are cases of deliberate error, which is deception. And I'm less interested in that in this book. People who knowingly disseminate false information, what they call fake news or whatever it is. I'm much more interested in cases where you see error, and I'm talking about error often in a factual case, factual instances of error, which you would think an educated analyst, historian, scholar would know better. But somehow even at that level, filtering goes on, which produces...
Give us a good example. Give us an example, I think, of just something from the book so we know what you're talking about.
All right, I'll give you the flagship piece in this book is about the 1948 Israeli conquest of Lydda, which was dramatized by Ari Shavit in his book, best-selling book, My Promised Land. That chapter dealing with Lydda was excerpted, and a version of it appeared in the New Yorker. So it became really the draw, the magnet, the hook for that book for many readers. And it postulated that there had been a massacre in Lydda in 1948 on a scale which would have been over twice as large as the massacre of Deir Yassin, which has somehow gone missing. No one had noticed. And so I looked at the account by Shavit, the numbers. Part of it was based on interviews which he had had with veterans of that battle. And it seemed to me improbable. There were so many aspects of it which seemed to me contrived or theatrical. And I began to ask myself, had an error taken place here? Not because Ari Shavit is out to besmirch the name of Israel, and I don't even take a particular interest in his motives there. But I began to sort of dig around, and I thought to myself, well, if Ari Shavit talked to these veterans of the Palmach, perhaps he wasn't the only person who talked to them. Perhaps someone else talked to them. So I went to Beit Palmach, which is around the corner here in Ramat Aviv, and I said, here are the list of people who Ari Shavit quotes in his account. Do you have records of interviews with them as well? I said, oh, yes. Not only do we have interviews, transcripts, we actually have DVDs with them on film in Lydda because a documentary filmmaker had taken these same people there. And I very quickly discovered that based on the same sources that Ari Shavit used, I could tell a completely different story.
But isn't that a matter of interpretation?
What, is it a matter of interpretation?
Well, if you said I could tell a different story based on the same facts, is it really error?
Was Ari Shavit lying? Is that what you're saying?
No, look, Ari Shavit, there's a problem here because Ari Shavit, he's not a historian, he's a journalist, and he's working from a private archive. That is, I didn't have access to the tapes that he used. One of the things I did was I asked him to deposit the tapes so that other historians could use them. He hasn't done it to this date. I was working from a public archive, so I don't know what he saw. And I don't know if he fairly represented what he saw. I have no idea of knowing. All I do know is that I could go to the public record left by those very same people, and the story emerges there is entirely different. And it's not a story of a vengeful massacre, but of a battle infused with fear. Mm-hmm. So these are two completely different narratives. And the problem here, of course, is that we're not working from the same database. The difference is I'm working from a public one and he's working from a private one. And
also there's even a bigger problem here that perhaps it's not really the person who's doing it, but the method itself. And that really lays bare the problems of oral history. I mean, is it something that you as a historian can safely rely on? Isn't that really what opens the door to the many errors that you explore in your book?
Look, oral testimony poses incredible problems, especially, and it's given at a considerable distance in time. The piece I did on Lydda, actually, there's two rounds that I go with Benny Morris here, whose work I do respect. Benny is a documentary fundamentalist. And as he doesn't rely on oral testimony at all, he only relies on documents, which is fine, except that there are instances in history for which there's no documentation whatsoever. The Lydda case would be one of them. Even Morris says there's nothing in the IDF archives or anywhere else to attest to this except for a single document, which I believe puts forward an account which was self-serving for the commanders who produced it. Mm-hmm. So what do you do in cases where you don't have any documentary evidence? You have to build, some of these issues become very crucial, especially in instances related to, for example, abuse of civilians. We have this also in contemporary accounts. So what you have to do is you have to do what you do with any kind of sources. You take the sources, you measure them against one another, and you look for corroboration. You look for patterns. You look to see if you can establish some kind of context for the source in order to validate it. Sometimes you can do it, sometimes you can't. There are things we'll never know. There's no question.
And I want to ask you perhaps a more general question here about the bias that you talked about, and is indeed the underlying premise of the book. Where does it come from? Why is it so prevalent?
I think bias basically infects all of us. I'm not an exception in that regard, and it emerges to some extent from who we are. We have our personal commitments. We're embedded in a society. We're embedded in a culture. We're embedded in a political system that has often an impact on the way in which we see the world. All of us have bias to some extent or another, but that doesn't mean that that none of us can practice a field such as history, which requires a measure of objectivity. In the book, I quote my mentor, Bernard Lewis, who was quoting a famous economist who said on one occasion that it's impossible to achieve perfect asepsis in the operating room, but at the same time, we don't perform operations in a sewer. We do the best we can. And while the bias can lead us to ask certain questions, and I admit that the questions I ask here emerged in no small part from my own commitments and my own interests, the things that excite and interest me. And they excite and interest me because I am embedded in a context.
Right. I mean, it's hard to imagine that you would read a whole chapter or a whole article about what happened in Lod and say, I don't accept this. I'm going to research it, completely without any sort of your own. You must have come at it saying, I don't really agree with this because my own bias says this doesn't seem right. So let me therefore open it up again.
No, I think I opened it up because I read it. It just didn't sound credible. But I may have been attracted to read the article in the first place with a critical eye. Because I was skeptic. Now, skepticism is a good thing to have overall, but the issues I choose emerge from my particular interest. But what I think the point that Lewis was trying to make is that while the questions may be defined by where one comes from, the answers one must strive to formulate in a way that shows a measure of detachment. And I'll give you another example from the book. I have a chapter here on Martin Luther King in the 1967 war. It's composed of several different parts, but what drew me to this topic was the claim that Martin Luther King had not said a certain statement in which he equated anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I thought that the evidence that he might have said that was credible because it came from a leading Harvard professor who was highly distinguished. Unlikely, it seemed to me that he would have fabricated it. But the kind of claim was made that Martin Luther King wasn't in Cambridge at the time. There wasn't an event like that. He couldn't have been there. And what I established there was a date, a time, and a place for the dinner which he supposedly attended, which he did attend, which he made that statement. But in the course of that, I became interested in other aspects of Martin Luther King in the 1967 war. And I discovered that Martin Luther King was extraordinarily ambivalent about the consequences of the war. He was thought to have been supportive of Israel because of a letter to the New York Times which he had signed with other leading Protestant theologians in support of Israel on the eve of the war. But then I looked, as I looked, I found transcripts of wiretaps of one of his associates. And in a conference call, Martin Luther King said, I don't know how my name got on that thing. He said, as published, it's not what I saw. It's too pro-Israel. I would have never said it. Now, if I had been determined to defend Israel's name and to mobilize Martin Luther King on behalf of the state of Israel, I could have left all that out. But it seemed to me too important and too interesting. And I imagine that chapter will probably be used now by critics of Israel to mobilize Martin Luther King against the occupation. Who knows? So the question was posed from my inner drive, but the answer came from the material.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, I mean, there's so many different directions I would like to take this, but let me ask you, this seems to fall into a certain sort of small group of other publications that I can identify in recent years dealing with a similar theme. I'm thinking of, a major Israeli columnist, Ben-Dror Yamini, who has a book called Ta'asiyat HaShkarim, or The Industry of Lies. I'm thinking of Mati Friedman, who's become very popular, sort of dismantling what he considers a conscious or unconscious bias in the global news media. Why do you see your book as part of that category and group? And why do you think there are several of them coming out now? And maybe I will even augment this question with something that I read that was more critical in the interviews that you've given on the book. One of them was with the participation of Hussein Ibish, who said, maybe this book is just a polemic against polemic. What do you think of that statement? Does it characterize the other examples that I mentioned? And why do you think this is happening now?
Well, I wouldn't speak to the other examples. I have great respect for the work of Ben Droliavini and also for Mati Friedman. They do important work, each in his area of specialization. My area of specialization is a little different. And I would put it more in the context of a continuation of an earlier book that I wrote, which was called Ivory Towers on Sand, The Failure of Middle Eastern Studies in America, which I published 15 years ago, and which was a critique of my own field. I think that in every area of endeavor, there's got to be a place for critical response. There has to be, I won't call it accountability, because we're in an atmosphere of intellectual freedom. But there's got to be give and take. In which assertions which are made are subject to critical scrutiny. Now, what you're pointing to is an inclination of certain scholars to be in a responsive or reactive mode to things that other scholars or writers are doing, and I think that's a career choice that one makes. This is a collected essay of basically responses, much more than it is a synthetic and coherent account of one subject, which plenty of historians and scholars do. I think there's a niche for that kind of thing, and I think without that kind of thing, a lot of error would go unchecked. So I don't know whether I'm part of a trend. I'm interested to hear that you say that there is such a trend.
No, but do you think that the history of the last 10 or 15 years made this kind of endeavor more necessary? Were there any grave mistakes that were made on behalf of the bias or misinterpretation of the Middle East?
Let me ask that in a more challenging way, because I think that there really is a very clear question we can ask. Do you think criticism of Israel has gotten tougher and more, painful for Israel to accept over the last 10, 15 years that is leading to this kind of reaction of works like the ones I cited and yours?
Mm.
I was actually thinking about the mismanagement of the Middle East by the consecutive American administrations. Yeah. But you take it. You answer this question, these questions, however you want.
There has long been a critique of Israel, and before that, a critique of Zionism, and polemics surrounding this on both sides. So it would be hard for me to say that this is something new. I think that more and more people are engaged in this kind of activity overall on both sides, on all sides of issues. So perhaps that gives, and all one has to do is to look up the number of books appearing on the subject. Mm-hmm. You often have authors here. I was administrator of a book prize dealing with the Middle East, and I was astonished at just how much is appearing. There's just huge volumes. So there's more of this and there's more of that now. I can give examples of earlier scholars. Take the whole debate there's a debate over the Balfour Declaration or over the World War I commitments under Sykes-Picot and Hussein McMahon, where you had Professors Kidori and Tibawi. This is another generation, people whose names you might not be familiar with.
I study nationalism.
Who engaged in the same sort of thing. And by the way, my project owes a great deal to Eli Kidori's approach. Of course. Kidori wrote a very famous essay called The Chatham House Version, which was a debunking of the established orthodoxy of in the British approach to the Middle East in the period between the world wars and the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So that kind of thing has a long history. There is, as I say, a greater volume overall of this. Of course, we have a lot of history since, as history unfolds, there are more and more instances about which there is debate. So now we have the post-67 situation. We have the continuation of Israeli policies in the West Bank. There's a whole list of other things which accumulate. But no, I think that it's been over 100 years of constant, ongoing back and forth.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to the orthodoxy that you mentioned in Middle East studies in the West in general. Mm-hmm. That is another issue that you explore at length in the book. Can you tell us briefly what are the main failings of that orthodoxy and how it really failed to face up to reality?
Middle Eastern studies is a branch of area studies, and it's important to understand the kind of people who've been drawn to it historically. We have the phrase that we use today of identity politics. A lot of people entered this field out of a commitment to one form or another of identity politics. It's a form of bias. And I think it increasingly manifested itself I'd say beginning in the 1970s and onward, in such a way as to turn, for example, the Middle East Studies Association, which I mentioned in the book, into a kind of a lobby, effectively a lobby, which is now contemplating a BDS resolution, a place where people use their scholarly credentials to enhance some political position.
Even as the U.S. government is debating federal laws that will define anti-Semitism at the same time.
Right. And so that had I'd say, corrupting effect on the field, because once a field begins to place politics above scholarship, then it establishes effectively, it requires oaths of allegiance to all those who would enter. I know many good people who wouldn't go near Middle Eastern studies as a career choice because they would have to preface it with some kind of statement or commitment to a political position. In this case, mostly pro-Palestinian, pro-Arab, call it what you will. And I think Edward Said had a real effect in accelerating that trend and in exacerbating that trend. Things are beginning to change in Middle Eastern studies because a wide array of people are entering the field, and it has to do with 15 years of American role in the Middle East. As I point out in the book, you've got about 2.5 million Americans who've been through the Middle East in one capacity or another, as soldiers, as contractors, as advisors, and so forth, which is unprecedented. And a lot of those people are beginning to filter into academia.
So the Saidian paradigm is gradually eroding, you think?
I think it is gradually eroding. And I think what you see in organizations like the Middle East Studies Association is an attempt to defend positions which they had held and built up over a period of 25 years, which are now under assault. So overall, I'm optimistic about Middle Eastern studies. I think it's going to change. And also the issues that interest people. I mean, it used to be that Middle Eastern studies was very much dominated by the study of the Palestinians. And I showed that statistically on a number of occasions. A number of papers presented on the Palestinians were far in excess of those on any other country in the region, which is what might be called disproportionate. Now people are interested in Syria. People are interested in Libya. People are interested in Iraq. They're interested in ISIS. And so young people who want to make their mark say, why should I go into a field where I have to make a pledge about BDS before I even get in the door when I can choose something else which is more topical, which is less politicized, which will bring me more attention, and which is frankly more in movement than the Israeli-Palestinian issue is today.
Yeah. All right. On this note, we'll have to wrap up. Professor Martin Kramer, a Middle East scholar and the founding president of Shalem College in Jerusalem, as well as the author of the recently published The War on Error, Israel, Islam, and the Middle East. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks to you both.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Dalia, and Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and of course, the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also check out our new website, telavivreview.org, and like us on Facebook. You can follow me as well as Dalia on Twitter, and don't hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.
במקום שהיום נגמר, בזמן שהלב מתחיל, לילה חוזר ומתגבר, ונסגרים מעגלים.